So, good afternoon, class. For this afternoon, we are now on Module 3, and this is entitled The Human Organism. Now, under this module, we will be tackling the basic information, particularly on the definition of human anatomy and human physiology. And later on in our discussion, we will be tackling structural and functional organizations of the human body, the characteristics of life, homeostasis, and terminology in the body plane. Now, for terminology and body plane, it is very important for us to be able to appreciate and understand the different parts of the human body because this subject matter is very unique in terms of its terminology. So we'll now start with the introduction to human anatomy. Now, by definition, anatomy is the scientific discipline that investigates the structure of the body, and it means to dissect or cut apart and separate different parts of the body for study. Now, if anatomy refers to the investigation of the structure, physiology, on the other hand, deals with the process or functions of these particular structures. So, in other words, it is very difficult to study anatomy without knowing its function. It would be very much easier for us to understand the different parts of the body if we will be able to correlate it with its physiology. Now, pathophysiology, on the other hand, refers to the disease processes that are that would affect the human organism should there will be a problem in the structure or in the functions. So, in other words, knowing the human anatomy and physiology forms the basic foundation for us to be able to appreciate the occurrence of diseases and the approaches of how we are going to treat or overcome those diseases. So it is really very important that we know the structure, and then later we'll know the function of that structure and how does this particular structure are related with each other in order for the entire organism to function. Now, any deviation from the structure or from its function would result to diseases, which we'll now be able to understand in the occurrence and in the management of that particular disease. Okay, now really believes that the human organism is a very complex structure and it has a very complex function. Now, we need to know that because with the intricacy of its functions and its structures, it would be very difficult for us to understand in the future other informations that will be fed upon us with regards to identification of diseases and disease management. So, because of the intricacy in the study of anatomy, authors have already made suggestions that we can actually study anatomy in several approaches. Now, one of the approach in the study of anatomy is by studying it through system. So we called it your systemic anatomy. And in this process, we try to study the body system such as the cardiovascular, the nervous, the skeletal, and the muscular systems, and how these systems interact with each other in order for that whole organism to function. Another approach is through regional anatomy. In regional anatomy, we study the body parts by areas, and within each region, such as the head, the abdomen, or the arm, all systems are studied simultaneously. Now, another important rather of studying anatomy and physiology is that uh, there are aspects of anatomy and physiology that are important in the diagnosis and in the management of diseases. Now, another approach to determine um, certain diagnostic approaches in the diagnosis of the diseases is the use of anatomy, and one of which is the surface anatomy, wherein we try to study the external features such as the bony projections, which serves as landmarks for locating deeper structures. And in that case, rather, we will be able to identify what parts of the body are usually involved in a particular disease process. And also, with the advancement in technology, we can now be able to study the internal organs of the body without the necessity of dissection, especially if we're dealing with living organisms, like living human beings who have these medical problems that needs to be diagnosed, and there would be difficulty in knowing the internal structure of that particular organism, except when we involve uh, the latest trend in technology, and that is what we call the anatomical imaging. And in this case, we involve the use of X-ray, ultrasound, MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging to create pictures of internal structures. So if we have all these things, then we can be able to study the internal structure of that particular organism. For example, in stroke. Now, while it is true that we can actually locate or localize the the primary lesion in stroke, but uh, doing some anatomical imaging will be able us to give will be able for us to be able we will be able to localize, rather, the lesions that causes the paralysis brought about by the stroke. So we use CT scans and MRIs for that, for that matter. Or if there is a problem in the internal organs of the body, like in the abdominal cavity, wherein uh, a physician will be entertaining liver abscess. So in order for us to be able to determine whether indeed the patient is suffering such disease entities, we can utilize we can rather, I'm sorry, we can utilize ultrasound to visualize the internal structure of the liver. Or another example is when we are entertaining uh, patients with difficulty in breathing, wherein in order for us to be able to assess the problem of the lungs, which is related to the difficulty in breathing, we can integrate or utilize X-ray to assess the anatomical structure of the lungs and then identify what part in the lungs are being involved in a particular disease process. So that is how we utilizes the informations that we have in studying anatomy. Now, since the body is a very complex system or organism, uh, it can be best studied with the 6 structural levels. Now, the structural levels of the body, being a complex organism, starts it with the basic. So the basic structure of the human body starts with the chemical level. So in the chemical level, it usually involves how atoms such as hydrogen and carbon interact and combine into molecules. And these molecules, once they are I mean, once they are produced, whatever the structure that they have will determine its function. So, in knowing anatomy, it's not only knowing the gross, but for you to be able to appreciate the why is it so that this is like this and this is like that, why is the bone so hard, why is the cartilage so soft, why is the heart so soft, why is the brain so soft. It will determine, it will rather be explained by the chemical composition of that particular organ system or particular organs. So the chemical level or the chemical composition of that particular organ will determine its function. And the function will be determined by the types of the molecule or structures that is present in that particular organ. Next is the cellular level. Now, after the interaction of this hydrogen and carbon that they form now in molecules, these molecules will interact and form and combine and becomes the cell. Now, this cell now is the basic structural and functional unit of all living organism. So, an organism can be unicellular, meaning composed of one cell. Example to that are bacteria. And or it can be multicellular, which is example to that is the human beings, which is composed of different types of cells, trillions types of cells, trillion cells rather, of different types and different origins because of the complexity of its function. So again, cells are the basic structural and functional units of the organism, and each cell is composed of organelles. Now the organelles are molecules combined and form the small structure that forms the cell. So what are the examples of organelles? You have the mitochondria, you have the Golgi apparatus, you have the nucleus, you have the, what else? Ribosomes. So these are minute organelles that are present in a very minute cells who has different functions, and whatever organelles that are present inside of that particular cell will determine the type of functions of that particular cell or of that particular organs. So if the organ is very active in metabolic processes, then the cellular organelles that are present inside the cells of that particular tissues are usually composed of numerous numbers of mitochondria. However, if the structure or if the organ is involved in providing strength, then the cellular component of the tissue of the particular organs will determine its function. So it will be different with the cells of the heart, the cells of the intestines, the cells of the lungs, the cells of the skin, and the cells of the brain. And we will be discussing that one in details once we reach the topic on organ system. So suffice it now to say that at the cellular level, the cells forms as the basic structures and it contains with its organelles. The types of cells, in terms of morphology, in terms of its organelles that are present, and the surrounding substances of that particular cells will determine the kind and function that these particular cells are involved. So next is the tissue level. So from chemical molecules, they group together, then they become cells. Then the cells So we said before that a human being is composed of groups of cells. These are trillions of cells. So when a cells group with each other, bearing with it the same morphology, the same materials surrounding its cells, then that becomes a tissue. So a tissue, in other words, by definition, is a group of similar cells and materials surrounding its cells. And the types or the characteristics of cells and the materials surrounding it will determine again the function of that particular tissue. Okay. Next is the organ level. Now for that organ, so chemical, groups of molecules becomes a cell, group of cells becomes a tissues, a group of tissues that perform one or more functions or one or more common functions is now what you call the organ level. So an organ level is composed of two or more types of tissues that together perform one or more common functions. Now, once these organs are grouped together having one common function, then that becomes an organ system. Example, cardiovascular. In a cardiovascular system, it is composed of the heart, which serves as the main organ responsible for the pumping of the blood, and then the arteries and veins, which serves as the conveyors or the passageways of this blood. So these are composed of two types of tissues or organs. So we have the heart as another organ, and then we have now the arteries and veins. Even the lungs is also part of the cardiovascular system, because this is where the blood vessels would, the blood rather would pick up oxygen, and also the blood. The blood is also a type of tissues, although they are not in a compact presentation, because these are fluids, but still they are classified as a tissue. Then we have the organism level. So the organism level now is considered as a whole. A living thing is considered as a whole, whether composed of one cell or trillions of cells. So is a bacteria an organism? Yes, because the bacteria can exist on its own. Human organism, is it an organism? Yes, but it becomes the biggest form of organism because of the complex organ system that this human being possess. So whether you are a unicellular or a multicellular organism, for as long as you can function as a whole, then you become, and then you are under the definition of an organism. Okay, so humans are organisms that share same characteristics with the other organisms, and one of the most striking feature of all organism is life. So life is the most important common feature of all organisms. Now, how do we know that there is life? So we have identified several characteristics to say that there is life. First is the organization. Now in organization, this refers to the specific relationship of the many individual parts of an organism, from cell to organelle to organs, interacting and working together. In other words, you can only say that there is life when that particular organism is composed of parts that forms and interacts with each other in order to come up with one common function. So that is the very basic structure of, an, of, of what organization is all about. Now, the question is, are bacteria possesses life, considering of the simplicity of the structure? Yes, because while it is true that they are only unicellular, the internal structure of that particular cell are composed of several organelles that functions to make that particular unicellular organism functional as a whole. So for human beings, we are the most complex type because we follow that the same definition, that from cells to organelles to organs and to system. So that is what we call organization. Next is metabolism. Now, for an organism to possess life, it must undergo metabolic processes or metabolic activity. And what do we mean by metabolism? So it is a function or it is an activity of that particular organism wherein in the process of its function utilizes energy. So if that particular organism follows certain independent activities or processes that in the process utilizes energy and has byproducts, and in return there will be effect. Either there will be growth, there will be movement, or there will be reproduction, then that becomes a characteristic of life. So again, there must be metabolism. Third is responsiveness. When you say responsiveness, this is the ability of the organism to sense changes in the environment and make the adjustment that help maintain its life. Later on, we will be discussing homeostasis, and homeostasis will give us a clearer picture of what responsiveness is all about. So it is the ability of that organism to respond to the adjustment in the environment or in the presence of an stimulus. Next is growth. Now, when we talk of growth, it refers to an increase in size of all or parts of the organism. So when there in a particular organism, when there is an increase in size, either due to an increase in number of cells or in the increase in the size of the cell, then it falls under the definition of growth. And if there is growth, then there is life. Now, how do we differentiate growth from development? Because it says development is another characteristic of life. In development, it includes the changes an organism undergoes through time. So from one type of cell, it will transform to another specialized type of cell. That is what you call development. So we term it the differentiation in the cell structures and functions, which is from generalized to specialized. One very concrete example to this, in the process of human reproduction. Now, a haploid cell coming from the female ovum and a haploid cell coming from the spermatozoa of the male, when they meet, they become one cell. And this cell do not stay there as one. Instead, they will undergo growth and differentiation and development rather. So in the process of development, these cells will try to reproduce another forms of cells, and these cells will undergo differentiation. And what do we mean by differentiation? that one cell later on during the process of embryology, in the embryonic life or in the embryonic development, um, this these cells will later on becomes the heart, or becomes the brain, or becomes the spinal cord, or becomes the hands and the feet. So it undergoes differentiation. So that is what you call development. And lastly is reproduction. There can only be life when there is reproduction. So reproduction can be either formations of new cells or formations of new organism. One concrete example is our skin. Every 2 weeks, we change our skin. How? Because there will be formations of new cells or new skin. Anything that is in the surface becomes extruded, and anything that is underneath will undergo differentiation, so that there will be reproduction of new cells. Okay, now let us proceed with the homeostasis. Now, a while ago, I've mentioned about the responsiveness of an individual to the environment. So that is a very characteristics. That is one of the characteristics of life. Now, what explains that responsiveness? It is what you call your homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is the existence and maintenance of a relatively constant environment within the body despite fluctuations in either the external or the internal environment. So, it can either be changes inside or changes in the outside, in the environment. So, in other words, the body has to maintain a certain balance. That is homeostasis. If there are changes in the environment on the outside and environment on the inside, the body will try to do something in order to maintain balance. And usually, homeostatic mechanisms are governed by the nervous systems or the endocrine system. Then, since it has to maintain the balance, the body has to respond to a particular set point. And that set point is determined by the normal range of values. Example, temperature. Now, each individual has its tolerability on temperature. So others can tolerate this much, others cannot. So what the body does is that it has a normal range, meaning in this particular level of temperature, this is where the human body is on the state of homeostasis or on the state of balance. It cannot have a specific absolute number of saying, let's say 37.0, because each individual differ with each other. So what it did physiologically is that our homeostatic mechanism has set a normal range of values that will determine the set point. And where does this set point is situated? Mostly it is in the central nervous system. So set point is the average normal value of the variable. So what is the variable then? Damo, it can be the pH, it can be the temperature, it can be pressure. So those are variables. Now the organ system helps control the internal environment so that it remain relatively constant, and that is what you call homeostasis. Now, how do we maintain or how do we regulate the body in order to maintain homeostasis? We have two mechanisms. One is the negative feedback mechanism, another is the positive feedback mechanism. Now let us start with the negative feedback mechanism. Under the negative feedback mechanism, in this context, it means to decrease. So pag sumaring ka nga, pag sinabi mo na you are under negative feedback mechanism, what you should be expecting is that there must be a decrease in the response of the body. Okay, now it is when any deviation of the set point is made smaller or is resisted. It does not prevent variation but maintain variation within normal range. And one of the classic example of negative feedback mechanism is the maintenance of the normal body temperature. Later I will discuss. Now, but before that, let us first determine the different component of the negative feedback mechanism. Now, for the negative feedback mechanism to function, it must contain three components. First is the receptor. So, the receptor is the one that monitors the value of a variable such as body temperature by detecting the stimuli. And where does this receptor are located? They are usually located in the skin of the body. So, if these receptors will be able to detect that stimulus, what are the stimulus? It can be high temperature or low temperature. So if that particular receptor will be able to pick it up, then it will send signals via chemical processes inside the skin until it reaches the control center. So the second component is the control center. And where does the control center is located? It is usually in the brain, and it is the one that determines the set point. So if, again going back, the receptor, if the receptors picks up something that is different from the environment, like extreme in temperature, masyadong mainit or masyadong malamig, then it will send signals until it reaches the control system. And at the control system, it will determine now the set point. If the temperature goes beyond the set point, then the temperature is very hot. But if the temperature is low below of the set point, then the environment must be very cold. So if the environment is very, very cold or the environment is very, very hot, then the body will try to maintain its balance by sending signals coming from the control center to the effector organs. So the third component now is the effector. So the effector in this case is the sweat gland. And any changes in the value will be detected by the effector, and the effector will eventually produce its homeostatic mechanism. Now, how? Okay, ganito yan. For example, there is an increase in temperature in the outside. Masyadong mainit. So that mainit will be picked up by the receptor. And the receptor will send signals to the receptor, to the control center. Now, at the control center, the brain will try to sense whether it was able to set the set point or not. Now, if it goes beyond from the set point, then it will now consider that the stimulus that reached to the brain is very, very hot, so that it will send signals to the effector organs in the skin, which are the sweat glands, to produce sweat. And what is the reason why the sweat will be produced? Because sweat is composed of water, and water will try to dissipate excess heat in the body so that the body now can be able to adjust the internal temperature with that of the external. So that is how the body now will try to maintain balance in terms of temperature. Now, what happens if the environment is very cold? If the environment is very cold, if the receptor cells or the receptor in the skin of the organism will try to sense that cold temperature and will try to send signals to the control center. And once it reaches the control center, it will determine on its it tests the to set point whether it goes above or beyond. So if it will not be able to reach the set point of the normal temperature of the body, then the body will sense that there is a cold environment, so that what will happen now, the control center will send signals to the effectors, which is now the muscle, which will produce the shivering effect. Because in doing the shivering effect, or in doing the shivering, in shivering, you will be producing heat. And in the process of producing heat, the body will now try to compensate the cold environment in the outside in order to be able to maintain the normal body temperature. So that is what you call the negative feedback mechanism. So the stimulus is change variable that initiate the homeostatic mechanism. Next is the positive feedback mechanism. If the negative is intended to decrease, for positive feedback mechanism, it occurs when the initial stimulus further stimulates the response. So the positive means that the deviation from the set point becomes greater, and positive indicates an increase. So kung ang negative is to decrease, positive means to increase. And positive mechanism can be detrimental instead of helpful. Now, one classic example of a positive feedback mechanism that is helpful, because it can be both detrimental and helpful. So helpful, one example to that is when a woman, a laboring woman, will deliver a baby. Now, the process of delivering the baby is that when the baby is now or have grown inside the uterus, it will try to stimulate the muscles to stretch. And in the process of stretching, the stretching will stimulate the brain to send signals to the muscular layer of the uterus to contract. Did you follow? So in a positive feedback mechanism, with the growth of the baby that causes stretching of the muscular wall of the uterine wall, will send signals to the brain, and then the brain will send signals to the muscular tissues or muscular layer of the uterus to contract further, because in that process it will try to help expel the baby in the intrauterine, so towards the extrauterine environment. So that is the positive feedback mechanism, the one that is beneficial for the patient. Now, how about the positive mechanism that is detrimental instead of helpful? One classic example is in situations wherein there is a massive blood loss. When there is massive blood loss, like in cases of trauma, so pag nasugatan ka, may maraming dugo ang lumabas sa'yo. Now, remember, homeostasis, the body will try to maintain. And what are the variables? It's not only temperature, pressure is also one. So the body has to maintain a particular blood pressure. Now, the blood pressure is determined by the cardiac output and the contractility of the heart. Now, if you have decrease in the volume of blood in the circulation, definitely your blood pressure will go down. So, when there is increase in the blood loss, upon decrease in the blood pressure, the body will try to react. So the brain again will send signals to the heart to keep on pumping, because it will be requiring so much pressure to pump the blood, the remaining blood that you have. And then aside from the signals of increase in pumping of the heart, it will send signals to the arteries for the arteries to constrict, meaning it will try to constrict its lumen so that the blood that is available in that particular area will not anymore get lost or will remain intact within the circulatory system. And another mechanism is that it will send signals to the kidneys to stop releasing your urine or reduce in the urine production. So there will be a decrease in the urine output, because remember, your urine comes from the ultrafiltrate of the fluid coming from the blood. So if that happens, if there is an increase in blood loss, it will try to stimulate the heart to pump and pump and pump. Now, what happens then? With the increase in cardiac rate, decrease in the blood flow because of vasoconstriction, and conservation of the kidneys, there will be a decrease in output, cardiac output. So, bababa ang level o ang dami ng dugo na ipapump ng heart. And remember, during the pumping of the heart also needs blood for its tissues, for the cardiac muscle to contract. Now, if it keeps on pumping and pumping at wala na siyang maipump na dugo, wala na ring dugo na papasok sa kanyang muscles, which later on will result to a decrease in cardiac activity. And if that happens, it will lead to death. Mamamatay din yung pasyente. That's why these are positive feedback mechanisms that becomes detrimental instead of being helpful with kapag wala tayong ginawang intervention. So, again, to review, homeostasis is the ability of the body to maintain balance. And in order to maintain its balance, it employs two types of mechanism, the negative feedback and the positive feedback. The negative feedback will try to decrease the response, while the positive feedback will try to increase the response. So, that is how the body will try to maintain its balance. Okay. So, if you have some questions, you can direct it to my messenger account for more clarifications. And hopefully I can answer all of them. And if you have some corrections with my lecture, you can also say so. Okay, now let's proceed now with the terminology and the body plane. Now, in order for us to know certain terminologies and body planes, it is very important that we first understand what anatomical position is all about. So, anatomical position refers to the standing upright of an individual with the face directed forward, the upper limbs hanging to the sides, and the palms, meaning this is the palms, of the hands are facing forward. So that is the normal anatomical, or that is the anatomical position. It is important for us to know that, because later on certain terminologies like knowing where is the anterior, where is the posterior, where is the lateral, where is the medial, you always go back to the anatomical position as your reference. So again, it is very important that you know what the anatomical position in order for you to be able to understand and appreciate the succeeding terminologies that has something to do or is in reference rather to the anatomical position. So, what are these terms that are related to anatomical positions? First is the supine. So when you say supine or in supination, you are describing that the patient is lying with the face upward. So, nakahiga siya na ang the face is directed upward. So, kumbaga ha termino naton na waray-waray, nahuyang nga nahigda. In prone, nakulob. Why? Because the patient is lying with the face downward. So, kung humuyang ngani, that's called supine. Pag prone ngani, meaning nakulob or downward. So, this is an example. This is the position of anatomical position except for the head. Because the head is directed to the side, but the anatomical position the correct anatomical position of this figure is that the face should be directed forward. And what I am emphasizing for this illustration are the positions of the hands, which is the anatomical position. So the palms is directed forward. Now, directional terms. This describes parts of the body relative to each other, so we know where is the right and where is the left. So these are directional terms in anatomical terminology. And how about superior? So superior refers to those that are above or up. For example, my eyebrow or my hair is superior to my eyebrow, but my eyes is inferior to my eyebrow. So pag sinabi mong superior, it is above that particular organ. So, the hair is superior to my eyebrow. But my eyes is inferior to my eyebrow. So, superior is above, inferior is below. Anterior naman goes before. So, this is my anterior. The belly is my anterior. And the back is my posterior. So it means that follows. So the one that follows my chest is the posterior. Okay. The ventral, this is the ventral, means the belly, which is also referred to as the anterior part. Whereas the dorsal means the back is the posterior surface or the dorsal surface. So the proximal, for the extremities, we use two terms, the proximal and the distal. The proximal means the nearest. So, my elbow is proximal compared to my wrist, which is the distal part. So, anything that is nearest to the body is proximal. All that is distant or away from the body is distal. Medial is on the midline, lateral naman is on the away from the midline. Now, superficial, well, all that is in the surface is superficial. All that is underneath the superficial are the deep. Okay, so I think this is I have lifted this from the book, and you can use this as your reference in knowing some terminology. And body parts and regions. So the central region of the body. So the body are divided into the central region and the trunk. The central region consists of the head, the neck, and the trunk. So that is the central body. The trunk can be divided into three: the thorax, the abdomen, and the pelvis. Okay. So the limbs are divided into two: the upper limb, which is composed of the arm, forearm, the wrist, and the hand. So pag sinabi mong arm, these are the area that extends from the shoulder to the elbow. So shoulder to the elbow, this is the arm. The forearm is from the elbow to the wrist. So this is my forearm. Okay, for the lower limb, it is divided into the thigh, leg, and ankle, foot. So the thigh extends from the hip to the knee, while the leg extends from the knee to the ankle. And for the abdomen is divided into two types, the quadrants and by regions. So the abdomen is divided into 4 quadrants, the upper right and the upper left, the lower right and the uh, lower left quadrants. And how do we divide this? We have an imaginary line from the side, or the horizontal line from that traverses the navel, and then the vertical line that extends from the xiphoid down to the navel and then to the pubic area, to the symphysis pubis. So those are two imaginary lines, the horizontal and the vertical, and it will now define how they divide the abdominal area into quadrants. Now, what is the clinical significance of this? We will now be if we do that, we will be able to appreciate what structures that are located in this particular organs. Say for example, in the right upper quadrant, you have your the liver and the gallbladder. On the left upper quadrant, you have there the stomach and the spleen. On the right lower quadrant, you have there the large intestines and the appendix. And in the left lower quadrant, again, we have the left the large and the small intestines. So it is also very important for us to know all these things. And also, aside from the quadrants, the abdomen is also subdivided into 9 regions. So 2 horizontal and 2 vertical. Now the planes. The sectioning of the body is a way to look inside and observe body structure. We have the sagittal plane that runs vertically through the body and separates into right and left. So sagittal plane. So right and left. While the median plane is a sagittal plane that passes through the midline of the body, dividing into equal half of right and left halves. Now the transverse plane is parallel to the body and divides the body into superior and inferior part. Now the frontal or the coronal plane runs vertically and divide the body into anterior and the posterior. So pag coronal, this is the coronal, it will divide. So all that is in this area is frontal, all that is behind is the posterior. Frontal, the anterior rather, the in this part is the anterior, all that is behind is the posterior. So that is for the coronal. So sections of the organs. Now, if you cut along its length, it becomes longitudinal. If you cut across, it becomes a cross section. But if you try to do it diagonally, that becomes an oblique section. Body cavities. So the human body is composed of several body cavities. In fact, we have 3, especially the trunk. Cavities are more located in the trunk. But there are also other cavities. We have the oral cavity, nasal cavity. But for the abdominal, other body cavities, especially from the trunk, you do have 3. The thoracic, the abdominal, and the pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity is surrounded by the ribs, and it is separated by the abdomen below, thoracic on the upper part, via the diaphragm. So it is a muscular structure that separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity. And the abdominal cavity is divided into 3. We have the right and the left mediastinum, with the central mediastinum as where the heart is located, or the mid-mediastinum. Then the abdominal cavity is bounded primarily by the abdominal muscle and contains the stomach, the intestine, the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, and the kidneys. Whereas the pelvic cavity is a small space enclosed by the bones of the pelvis and contains the urinary bladder, part of the small and large intestines, and the internal reproductive organs of both the male and female. Now, these cavities are being covered with membranes, and these membranes line the trunk cavities and cover the organs of the cavities. So, since it's a cavity, pag cavity nga ni women, it is a space. And this space on the outer part is composed of membranes. We call it serous membranes. Now, this serous membranes is divided into three parts. The visceral part, which is the one that is attached with the organ, while the parietal is the outer part. And then in between the visceral and the parietal is a space that contains fluids of thin lubricating substance that would prevent the friction of these two membranes, the visceral and the parietal membrane. Now, I have lifted this from the book. This is how we imagine the membrane. So this hand here is the organ, and this is the covering. The one that is adherent to the organ is the visceral. The one that is away from this is the parietal. So in between of the visceral and the parietal is the space that contains lubricating fluid. And where is it present? It can be present in the lungs. Ano man ang clinical significance to this? Later on, when we study about the lungs, especially the diseases, there are disease entities that would result to the accumulations of fluid in this area, which we called pleural effusion. So that's it. Other cavities of the body. So we have again the pleura here. The pleura is in the lungs, and then we have the heart. So we have the pericardium, the parietal pericardium, and the visceral pericardium. So in the lungs we call it pleura. In the heart we call it pericardium. And then we have the pericardial activity. Then on the abdomen, these organs, the liver, the spleen, and other structures, these are also covered by membranes, which we call your peritoneum. Okay. So pag lungs, pleural. Pag heart, pericardial. Pag abdomen, you call it peritoneal. So at the peritoneal area, there is also what we call a mesentery, which are two layers of peritoneum fused together that connects the visceral peritoneum of some abdominopelvic organs to the parietal peritoneum on the abdominal wall. And this usually serves as a passageway for nerves and blood vessels that would reach the organs. And also, we have also the so-called retroperitoneal organs. These retroperitoneal organs are organs that includes the kidneys, the adrenal glands, the portion of the pancreas, and parts of the small intestines and large intestines, and the urinary bladder. So these are organs that is located beneath or behind on the posterior side of the peritoneum. And I think that's all for this afternoon. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And I will be sending you your questionnaire for your self-assessment test. And hopefully you will be able to submit it via online. And that will be your requirement for your access to the next module, which is module 4. So if you have some questions with regards to the lecture that I have presented this afternoon, feel free to send your messages to my messenger, and I will be very much willing to reply to all your queries. So once again, thank you very much, and good afternoon. See you on our next session.